Hey guys, I'm super excited to get back into the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane, and let's see what happens next. And in this manner, Edward's days passed, one into the other. Nothing remarkable happened. There was occasional small domestic drama. Once, while Abilene was at school, the neighbor's dog, a male brindled boxer, inexplicably named Rosie, came into the house uninvited and unannounced and lifted his leg on the dining room table, spraying the white tablecloth with urine. He then trotted over and sniffed Edward, and before Edward even had time to consider the implications of being sniffed by a dog, he was in Rosie's mouth. And Rosie was shaking him back and forth vigorously, growling and drooling. Naughty dog. Fortunately, Abilene's mother walked past the dining room and witnessed Edward's suffering. "Drop it!" she shouted to Rosie, and Rosie, surprised into obedience, did as he was told. Edward's silk suit was stained with drool, and his head ached for several days afterwards, but it was his ego that had suffered the most damage. So, how he felt about himself. He has very high standards and thinks of himself so very highly, and now his ego is a little bit damaged. Abilene's mother had referred to him as it, and she was more outraged at the dog urine on her tablecloth than she was about the indignities that Edward had suffered at the jaws of Rosie. And then there was the time that a maid, new to the Tulane household and eager to impress her employers with her diligence, came upon Edward sitting on his chair in the dining room. "What's this bunny doing here?" she said out loud. Edward did not care at all for the word bunny. He found it very derogatory in the extreme. So he finds being called a bunny very offensive. The maid bent over him and looked into his eyes. "Huh," she said. She stood back up. She put her hands on her hips. "I reckon you're just like every other thing in this house, something needing to be cleaned and dusted." And so the maid vacuumed Edward Tulane. She sucked each of his long ears up the vacuum cleaner hose. She pawed at his clothes and beat his tail. She dusted his face with brutality and efficiency, and in her zeal to clean him, she vacuumed Edward's gold pocket watch right off his lap. The watch went into the maw of the vacuum cleaner with a distressing clank that the maid did not even seem to hear. When she was done, she put the dining room chair back at the table, and, uncertain about exactly where Edward belonged, she finally decided to shove him in among the dolls on a shelf in Abilene's bedroom. This is going to make Edward very mad. She took the watch that he uses to tell when Abilene is coming home, and he's not by the window where Abilene set him. "That's right," said the maid. "There you go." She left Edward on the shelf at a most awkward and inhumane angle. His nose was actually touching his knees, and he waited there with the dolls twittering and giggling at him like a flock of demented and unfriendly birds, until Abilene came home from school, found him missing, and ran from room to room calling his name. "Edward! Edward!" she shouted. There was no way, of course, for him to let her know where he was, no way for him to answer her. He could only sit and wait. When Abilene found him, she held him close, so close that Edward could feel her heart beating, leaping almost out of her chest in its agitation. "Edward! Oh, Edward! I love you! I never want you to be away from me!" The rabbit, too, was experiencing a great emotion, but it was not love. It was annoyance that he had been so mightily inconvenienced, that he had been handled by the maid as cavalierly as an inanimate object. He was treated like a serving bowl or a teapot. The only satisfaction to be had from the whole affair was that the new maid was fired immediately. Edward's pocket watch was located later, deep within the bowels of the vacuum cleaner, dented, but still working. It was returned to him by Abilene's father, who presented it with a mocking bow. "Sir Edward," he said, "your timepiece, I believe." The Rosie affair and the vacuum cleaner incident were the greatest dramas of Edward's life until the night of Abilene's 11th birthday, when, at the dinner table, as the cake was being served, the ship was mentioned. Chapter 3. "She's called the Queen Mary," said Abeline's father, "and you and your mamma and I shall sail on her all the way to London." "What about Pellegrina?" said Abilene. "I will not go," said Pellegrina. "I will stay." Edward, of course, was not listening. He found the talk around the dinner table excruciatingly boring. In fact, he made a point of not listening if he could help it. But then Abilene did something unusual, something that forced him to pay attention. As the talk about the ship continued, Abilene reached for Edward and took him from his chair and stood him in her lap. "What about Edward?" she said, her voice high and uncertain. "What about him, darling?" said her mother. "Will Edward be sailing on the Queen Mary with us?" "Well, of course, if you wish, although you are getting a little old for such thing as China rabbits." "Nonsense," said Abeline's father jovially. "Who would protect Abilene if Edward was not there?" He's like picking at her again. He's not really being serious. From the vantage point of Abeline's lap, Edward could see the whole table spread out before him in a way that he never could when he was seated in his own chair. He looked upon the glittering array of silverware and glasses and plates. He saw the amused and condescending looks of Abeline's parents, and then his eyes met Pellegrina. She was looking at him in a way that a hawk hanging lazily in the air might study a mouse on the ground. Perhaps the rabbit fur on Edward's ears and tail and the whiskers on his nose had some dim memory of being hunted, for a shiver went through him. "Yes," said Pellegrina, without taking her eyes off Edward. "Who would watch over Abilene if the rabbit was not there?" That night, when Abilene asked, as she did every night, if there would be a story, Pellegrina said, "Tonight, lady, there will be a story." Abilene sat up in bed. "I think that Edward needs to sit here with me," she said, "so that he can hear the story too." "I think that's best," said Pellegrina. "Yes, I think that the rabbit must hear the story." Abilene picked Edward up, sat him next to her in bed, and arranged the covers around him. Then she said to Pellegrina, "We're ready now." "So," said Pellegrina. She coughed. "And so the story begins with the princess." "A beautiful princess?" Abilene asked. "A very beautiful princess." "How beautiful?" "You must listen," said Pellegrina. "It's all in the story." All right, I got to pause really quick to take a Google Meet phone call, but I want to get this story in this video today. So give me a second. You won't have to wait long because I'll edit the video, but we'll go on to Pellegrina's story and chapter 4 in just a moment. Hey there, happy Monday. So this might be a little confusing, but I did not finish Friday's clip and just could not get it uploaded on Friday. So I'm going to make this video twice as long. So you got chapter 2 and 3. Now you're going to get chapters 4 and 5. I also have some people from our lunch bunch here that are staying in and watching me film this video. So Anna, Cam, Maya, they are on this video watching me film it. So anyways, this is 4 chapters in this video, and let's enjoy it. All right, chapter 4. Pellegrina is going to tell the story. Abilene asked again, "Will you tell us the story?" And she said, we ended with, "You must listen. It's all in the story." Okay? Chapter 4. Once there was a very beautiful princess. She shone as bright as the stars on a moonless night. But what difference did it make that she was beautiful? None. No difference. "Why did it make no difference?" asked Abilene. "Because," said Pellegrina, "she was a princess who loved no one and cared nothing for love, even though there were many who loved her." At this point in her story, Pellegrina stopped and looked right at Edward. She stared deep into his painted-on eyes, and again, Edward felt a shiver go through him. This is Pellegrina telling the story to Abilene and Edward. "And so," said Pellegrina, still staring at Edward. "Well, what happened to the princess?" said Abilene. "And so," said Pellegrina, turning back to Abilene, "the king, her father, said that the princess must marry. And soon after this, a prince came from a neighboring kingdom, and he saw the princess, and immediately he loved her. He gave her a ring of pure gold. He placed it on her finger. He said these words to her: "I love you." But do you know what the princess did? Abilene shook her head. She took the ring and she swallowed it. She took it from her finger and she swallowed it. She said, "This is what I think of love." And she ran from the prince. She left the castle and she went deep into the woods. And so what? Said Abilene. What happened then? And so the princess became lost in the woods. She wandered for many days. Finally, she came to a little hut and she knocked on the door. She said, "Let me in. I'm cold." There was no answer. She knocked again. She said, "Let me in. I am hungry." A terrible voice answered her, and the voice said, "Enter if you must." The beautiful princess entered, and she saw a witch sitting at a table counting pieces of gold. 3,622, said the witch. "I'm lost," said the beautiful princess. "What of it?" said the witch. 3,623. "I'm hungry," said the princess. "Not my concern," said the witch. 3,624. "But I'm a beautiful princess," said the princess. 3,625, replied the witch. "My father," said the princess, "is a powerful king. You must help me or there will be consequences." "Consequences?" said the witch, who looked up from her gold. She stared at the princess. "You dare to talk to me about consequences? Very well, then, we'll speak about consequences. Tell me the name of the one you love." "Love?" said the princess. She stamped her foot. "Why must everyone always speak to me about love?" "Who do you love?" said the witch. "You must tell me the name." "I love no one," said the princess proudly. You disappoint me," said the witch. She raised her hand and said one word: "Farthfiggery." And the beautiful princess was changed into a warthog. "What have you done to me?" squealed the princess. "Talk to me about consequences now, will you?" said the witch, and she went back to counting her pieces of gold. 3,626. And the witch, as the warthog princess ran from the hut and out again, said the witch, as the warthog princess ran out from the hut and again into the forest. The king's men were in the forest too, and what were they looking for? A beautiful princess. And so when they came upon an ugly warthog, they shot it immediately. Pow! "No," said Abilene. "Yes," said Pellegrina. The men took the warthog back to the castle, and the cook slit open its belly, and inside it she found a ring of pure gold. There were many hungry people in the castle that night, and all of them were waiting to be fed. So the cook put the ring on her finger and finished butchering the warthog. And the ring that the beautiful princess had swallowed shone on the cook's hand as she did her work. The end. "Yes," said Pellegrina. "That's the end?" said Abilene indignantly. "Yes," said Pellegrina, "the end." "It can't be." "Why can't it be?" "Because the end came too quickly, because no one's living happily ever after. That's why." "Ah, and so," Pellegrina nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "But answer me this. How can a story end happily if there is no love?" "But, well, it is late. You must go to sleep." Pellegrina took Edward from Abilene, and she put him in his bed and pulled the sheet up to his whiskers. She leaned close to him, and she whispered, "You disappoint me." That's a horrible thing to say to someone. She whispered, "You disappoint me." After the old lady left, Edward lay in his bed and stared up at the ceiling. The story, he thought, had been pointless, but then most stories were. He thought of the princess and how she had become a warthog. How gruesome! How grotesque! What a terrible fate! "Edward," said Abilene, "I love you. I don't care how old I get. I will always love you." "Yes, yes," thought Edward. He continued to stare up at the ceiling. He was agitated for some reason that he could not name. He wished Pellegrina had put him on his side so that he might look at the stars. And then he remembered Pellegrina's description of the beautiful princess. She shone as bright as the stars on a moonless night. For some reason, Edward found comfort in these words, and he repeated them to himself. As bright as the stars on a moonless night, as bright as the stars on a moonless night, over and over until at last the first light of dawn appeared. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with its finest suits and several of his best hats, and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with this suit?" she asked him. "Or would you like to wear your black derby? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it?" And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward, Abilene, and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye, Abilene." "Goodbye." I'm sorry, I had to reread that. "Goodbye," Abilene shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." And the ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp in his ears. Oh, it was Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkled clothing. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved to see the last of her. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention on board the ship. "Oh, what a singular rabbit," said an elderly lady with strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. That means they wanted him. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene. "I'm afraid he's not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Well, does he wind up anywhere?" asked Amos. "No," said Abilene. "He does not wind up." "Well, what's the point of him then?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abilene. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," agreed Martin. And then after a long thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me neither," said Amos. "Does his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Well, of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits, and he has his own pajamas, too. They're made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing in off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. The robot was thinking that he must look quite dashing. I guess a straw boater is a hat. It came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped off of his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then, held upside down, he watched the watch roll merrily toward Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear, and Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassed glances his way. "Give him to me," screamed Abilene. "He's mine." "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clasped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Please," cried Abilene. "Don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could happen to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in the same naked state from the hands of one grubby laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," called Martin. Amos raised his arm, and just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. So it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane flew overboard. Oh man, that was an intense scene. And because Martin and Amos took him, he's now going overboard on a giant cruise ship. How are they ever going to get him back? He's going to be devastated. He loves Abilene. Tune in next time to see what happens.